Wednesday, China held a massive military parade in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, showcasing a long list of new weapons, drones, aircraft, and more, in a spectacle meant to both commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II and, maybe more importantly, to garner media publicity around the globe for the nation's new top-of-the-line defense technologies. While Russia has made a name for itself in the information space with its far-reaching web of state-run news outlets and hordes of troll commenters, China is arguably the best in the game. While many Russian influence efforts could be described as heavy-handed, often embracing the quantity over quality approach, China has taken on a whole-of-government strategy that, in some ways, combines Russian-style online influence campaigns with America's own Cold War approach to leveraging soft power, economic might, and, at times, direct intimidation to achieve its strategic objectives. So, while I will run through some of the more important pieces of gear shown off in this parade, that's not really what this week's video is about. Instead, I'm here with a warning. China is indeed a serious player in the defense space, with massive investments, not just into its latest military technologies, but into the academic and research infrastructure required to keep advancing in this space. But as we discuss China's rapid military advancement, it is really important that we not forget that these discussions are a battlefield in themselves, with active combatants waging information warfare against the civilian populace of the world, using every tool they have available to convey one simple message: that China is too advanced, too capable, too powerful to stand against. But this isn't a new song and dance. In fact, it's one that a lot of us know by heart at this point. In just the past few years, we've seen decades worth of Russian influence efforts drowned in the muddy fields of Ukraine, where the once mighty Russian military has struggled for literally years now to conquer about 20% of a nation the size of Texas that sits on its own border. We've seen years worth of Iranian threats, bluster, and narrative warfare efforts go dark all at once as Israeli fighters pierce their integrated air defenses night after night with seeming impunity. And while China is not Russia or Iran, there are nonetheless lessons that we can and that we need to learn about warfare in the digital age from recent history. Because whether you realize it or not, the fight is already underway, and the first battlefield is in the comments. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. China's military parade in Beijing included a long list of high-end defense technologies, from the latest iterations of their fifth-generation fighters, the J-20 and J-35, to new drones and new ICBMs. But notably, it also didn't include several of the experimental stealth aircraft that we've seen photographed over China in recent months. And there's probably a good reason for that. I still stand by my position that most, if not all, of these new jets we've seen in testing are technology demonstrators that are all part of a broader Chinese effort to cultivate the experience, knowledge, and know-how that it takes to rapidly develop new stealth aircraft within the nation's industrial base, effectively working to close the really wide experiential gap between American and Chinese stealth fighter production, and making a really important step toward creating their own advanced designs rather than simply modifying and copying stolen or purchased ones. Now, I'd contend that one of the most important categories of technology on display was China's fully developed nuclear triad. A nuclear triad, in its simplest terms, means a nation boasts the ability to deploy nuclear weapons from the air, meaning from aircraft, from land, meaning from surface-launched missiles, and from sea. usually from submarines. The premise behind the triad is also simple. It's the idea that you distribute your nuclear capabilities so no nuclear first strike, no matter how severe, could stop you from responding with nuclear strikes of your own. And at the heart of China's new nuclear triad is their latest and greatest intercontinental ballistic missile, a weapon that we've seen discussed under several designations in recent years, but now appears to officially be known as the DF-61. This road mobile ICBM appears to be launched from the same sort of transporter erector launchers as its predecessor, the DF-41, and has seen reported ranges varying from as short as 7,500 miles to as far as more than 9,300. But in either case, it has the legs to reach the American mainland. And thanks to being mobile, these weapons could be tougher to target and neutralize prior to an offensive launch. Along with the rest of the triad, including the H-6N bomber and the JL-3 submarine-launched ballistic missile, we also got a look at a series of new undersea drones that alone offered little detail in terms of projected capabilities. A variety of anti-drone weapons that included lasers, microwaves, and kinetic interceptors, which China calls their anti-drone triad, and we also got a good look at a variety of anti-ship weapons that some news outlets, like Reuters, mistakenly described as all hypersonic, which does not appear to be the case, but some certainly do appear to fit the bill. The YJ-15 is a ramjet-powered supersonic anti-ship cruise missile, meaning it flies at speeds above Mach 1 but all but certainly below Mach 5 along a relatively horizontal flight path under air-breathing ramjet power. The YJ-17, on the other hand, boasted a warhead that looked a whole lot like a hypersonic glide vehicle, or maybe even a wave rider design, meaning it's meant to effectively ride the shockwaves being generated by its own high-speed flight. The YJ-19 also looks to have the makings of a legitimate hypersonic weapon. This time, a scramjet, or a supersonic combustion ramjet-powered anti-ship cruise missile, complete with visible intake to funnel air into that scramjet. And finally, the YJ-20, which at least appears to be a more conventional anti-ship ballistic missile. But in the media fervor to cover this parade, I've grown genuinely concerned that many in the West have missed the most important element of Chinese force projection on display before, during, and since the parade. China's very intentional use of this and similar events to shape the world's perceptions of its military capabilities. Or, as J. Michael Dahm, a Chinese military expert with the Air Force Association's Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, told Air and Space Forces magazine just this week, and I quote, "The People's Liberation Army is showing the world and the US military exactly what they want us to see. The equipment selected, the technologies showcased, the precision with which the parade was executed, all have been carefully choreographed to shape perceptions and message target audiences around the world. The PLA has been rehearsing and preparing this parade for months. Nothing was left to chance." Now, this sentiment was also echoed by Pacific Air Force's commander, General Kevin Schneider, earlier in the week when he said, and I quote, "Nations like China and North Korea and Russia and others do these kinds of events. There's certainly a big focus on messaging." And this is the point in the video where, to some of you, I may sound a bit like a broken record, because the way nations like Russia and China leverage Western, and even more specifically, American media against their own people has come up pretty often as of late. And while we have discussed elements of this before, the problem absolutely persists. One of the topics I've been meaning to cover on this channel for a few years now is something that I've taken to calling the transparency gap, and how it plays a really big role in shaping our perceptions of global military powers. You guys know that I'm not a big fan of how the modern American media apparatus has become a profit-driven hyperbole machine, but like America itself, its media has lots of serious problems, but still manages to do quite a bit of good. I may get frustrated with sensationally bad takes about the F-35 making headlines every other week, or with the way warring political ideologies have made it harder than ever for Americans to just choose their beliefs a la carte rather than as a team sport. But my frustrations notwithstanding, the American media's affinity for reporting on bad news about America leads to levels of criticism, critique, and accountability in the public sphere that just don't exist within America's geopolitical rivals. America's media may be deeply flawed, but it is free. And before you comment to tell me that isn't true, bear in mind that I would not be able to make my content the way that I do inside China, or Russia for that matter. In the US, problems with big ticket defense programs like the B 2 Spirit in the 1980s, the Patriot Air Defense System in the 1990s, the F 22 in the 2000s, and the F 35 in the years since, all made for great headlines that were sure to drive tons of views, clicks, comments, and shares. And that's incentive enough for American journalists to throw their weight around in search of the next big scandal. And this benefits us because cost overruns shouldn't go unchecked. Failing programs shouldn't limp along forever. And sometimes public pressure is the best way to force change at corporate or government levels. But it also hurts the American defense endeavor in at least one unique way. Airing America's dirty laundry sells, so the American media does it just about every day. And that starts to lead lots of people, including Americans themselves, to believe that that dirty laundry is all we've got. Especially when juxtaposed against the lack of similar stories to emerge from nations like Russia and China. Because, well, it's illegal for the local media to report on similar stories out of Russia or China. And just to exacerbate the problem, when Russian or Chinese dirty laundry does bubble its way to the surface, well, it usually doesn't sell quite as well as the American brand of doom and gloom, so it sees less press coverage and doesn't last as long in the news cycle, at least here in the West. And in the past, I've described this transparency gap as comparing American reality to China or Russia's carefully curated Instagram feeds. We all know about the F-35's developmental struggles, its mission-capable rates, its cost per flight hour, its hourly maintenance requirements. Heck, we've even calculated how much we figure the whole program will cost over the span of 94 years, from spare parts to building repair facilities out through 2088, just to come up with that very scary $2 trillion program cost included in headlines that make the rounds every few months. But what developmental struggles has China disclosed about the J-20? Well, the only ones we know about are the ones they can't hide, like still not having its intended WS-15 turbofan engines in serial production, despite the fact that the fighter's been in service for more than 8 years already. What are the J-20's mission-capable rates? How much does it cost per hour to fly? How many hours of maintenance does it need for every hour of flight time on average? The answer to these questions is that we basically don't have any idea. China does not disclose any of that information. So when you hear there's another delay in fielding Tech Refresh 3 for the F-35, but you never hear about any delays associated with the J-20, well, our swollen monkey, or let me be corrected here, our swollen ape brains pick out the pattern. The F-35 has problems, and the J-20 does not. Of course, lots of us know better, but most of the general public doesn't have time to worry about this transparency gap. They've got bills to pay and kids to get to soccer practice. Their perception of programs like the F-35 is shaped by the headlines they scroll past in between memes about Taylor Swift and K-pop demon hunters. But this isn't a new thing. We've seen it play out before, especially in the years leading up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when American media outlets were breathlessly reporting on every new press release to come out of the entire Russian defense industry, regardless of how baseless the claims within them ultimately proved to be. When a bipedal robot named Boris took the stage at the Putin Youth Forum in the city of Yaroslavl, Russia, back in December of 2018, Western news outlets reported on this remarkable feat of engineering. Until it was Russian social media users that figured out it was actually just a guy in a $3,700 robot costume. When Russia announced that they were deploying the world's first infantry support ground combat drones to Syria back in May of 2017, the Western media jumped on the bandwagon, drawing comparisons between Russia's drone, called the Uran 9, and Terminator's Skynet, wondering when America would catch up. Of course, it was soon revealed that the robot was practically useless. It couldn't accurately fire rounds downrange. It couldn't travel more than 300 meters from its operator, and it saw complete control failures or unexpected shutdowns on 19 separate occasions during its very brief deployment. And that part of the story leaked from a Russian security conference and didn't make many headlines here stateside. When Russian defense contractor Rostec announced the development of Predator-style active camouflage in the summer of 2018, it once again saw Western media rounds, despite the pictures released by Rostec looking a lot more like airsoft gear, and nothing coming of this effort now 7 years later. The same summer, Kalishnikov unveiled its new biped warfighting robot to a flood of news coverage, even though it turned out to just be a statue outside the famed rifle maker's offices. All of these and lots of other Russian defense tech stories began as puff pieces written in media outlets owned by or tied to the Russian government, which were then picked up on the international wire and repackaged by Western journalists with looming deadlines to hit as breaking news, rather than as the Kremlin-sponsored propaganda that it actually was. And when you understand that, it gets a lot easier to see why so much of the Western world chose to believe Russia when they said their advanced air defense systems, like the S-300 and S-400, had an objectively unrealistic 100% intercept rate in both testing and combat. Though it is worth noting that Russia didn't have everybody fooled. As researchers Shay Cotton and Jeffrey Lewis pointed out in their analysis for the Nuclear Threat Initiative back in 2021, Russia alleges the S-400 system was tested a total of 32 times across 6 combat exercises with 0 failures, which is almost certainly misleading. I'll quote them directly now. During these tests, Russian forces fired an unknown number of interceptors, intercepting an unknown number of targets of unknown capability. Furthermore, Russia reported to state media that 100% of the attempted S-400 intercepts were successful. To date, we have not been able to identify any reports of failed intercept tests involving the S-400. Like our hypothesis involving India, this suggests Russia is concealing most of its developmental tests or other failed intercepts. Now, it's important to note that testing failures aren't necessarily a sign of trouble. In fact, testing a new system to its failure points may be among the most important things an emerging program can do. Otherwise, the outer limits of the system's performance will be theoretical until operators are forced to find out the hard way in combat. Likewise, it's through testing failures that areas of focus for future upgrades can be identified. Just like in any facet of life, you can often learn more from failure than you can from success. Thanks to widespread media coverage of America's MIM-104 Patriot air defense system performing poorly against ballistic missiles back in 1991's Gulf War, the onset of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine saw many in the West assuming Russian air defenses were all but impenetrable, while reports of Patriot batteries being transferred to Ukraine were initially met with very little fanfare and even a bit of mocking derision. Of course, it wasn't long before the world came to realize 2 things. The first was that Russian air defenses were anything but impenetrable, with Ukrainian aircraft, drones, and missiles now confirmed through photographic evidence to have destroyed at least 2 S-400 command posts, 18 S-400 launchers, 1 S-400 surveillance and tracking radar array, 4 acquisition radar arrays, and another 6 engagement radar arrays to date, according to the popular online equipment tracker Oryx. And the second was that today's Patriot air defense system is a far cry from the one that struggled against ballistic missiles in the early 90s, quickly bringing down Russia's air-launched Kinzhal missiles over Kyiv and proving once and for all that they were nothing more than air-launched ballistic missiles that Russia just called hypersonic for the same reasons they claimed the S-400 had a 100% intercept rate. Now, this isn't meant to be a victory lap for American hardware. It's important to note that Russian air defense systems are objectively pretty capable systems. And it's just as important to note that Patriot, despite its long list of upgrades and impressive track record as of late, is not infallible. No air defense capability is. Rather than comparing Russian and American capabilities here, like we normally might do, I really mean to draw attention to the way popular perceptions of military capabilities are often shaped more by media narratives, headlines, and even memes than by actual battlefield performance. And that is dangerous because politicians are not only just as susceptible to the disinformation game as the rest of us, but they're also often swayed by public opinion, whether that opinion is based on reality or not. And I know the common arguments made by those who refuse to acknowledge the role that narrative warfare plays in modern conflict. And they'll say American lawmakers have access to all kinds of secret and classified intel, so we should trust what they have to say. And to that, I'll just say that having information available to you is not the same as actually reading it. My work's been cited more than once by the Congressional Research Service in reports for lawmakers, and that's something that I take a lot of pride in, despite the fact that I'm not entirely convinced many lawmakers actually take the time to read those reports. Prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, popular perceptions suggested that Russia's emphasis on advanced air defenses as a means to counter NATO's significant air power advantages had resulted in potentially globe-leading anti-air capabilities. And this narrative was bolstered by media coverage that, again, often relayed Russian claims without any notable analysis or critique. Now, reports from the battlefield have largely done away with many popular misconceptions about Russian capabilities, with hard evidence finally tearing a hole through that transparency gap we talked about. But it is so important that we recognize that we didn't solve this problem. We cannot and should not rely on open war to balance our skewed perspectives or to inject reality into our analysis. The transparency gap remains. And as we shift our focus toward America's real geopolitical competitor, China, this gap becomes even more difficult to overcome in some respects. Because China's efforts come in a long list of different forms, from online influence campaigns to false claims in academic journals to some of their most effective strategies, just passing out big old bags of money. In 2019, then Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morley tweeted in support of Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests, resulting in China severing a multi-billion-dollar television deal with the NBA. Now, 3 years later, the NBA returned to Chinese television, with NBA China now estimated to be worth $5 billion, of which 90% is owned by the NBA, 5% is owned by ESPN, and the remaining 5% is owned by the Chinese government. A further ESPN investigation found that the 40 principal team owners in the NBA now own a collective $10 billion or more in Chinese investments, some with companies under sanctions by the US government. In any case, the NBA learned to quell anti-Chinese rhetoric at every level of the league to protect that giant pool of money. And we've seen this form of economic policing play out time and time again, with China using access to its markets to force movies to make changes to details, characters, and sometimes entire plot lines just to appease Chinese government censors. Remember that pretty silly Red Dawn remake in 2012 that showed North Korea invading the United States? Well, that whole movie was actually filmed using China as the antagonists, until the studio was pressured by the Chinese government to change it, so after they finished filming, they used CGI to go back and cover every Chinese flag with a North Korean one, and replaced Chinese dialogue with Korean dubs. The Marvel movies, which may be more guilty than most, even cast Tilda Swinton to play a traditionally Tibetan character called the Ancient One, because China would not allow a positive depiction of Tibet in a movie released in their markets. The Bruce Willis movie Looper saw its entire third act rewritten and moved from Paris to Shanghai, with Willis's on-screen wife changed to a Chinese actress, again, to appease the Chinese government. The list goes on, and if you think China policing the way NBA managers tweet about Hong Kong or the way Marvel movies depict Tibet has nothing to do with China's efforts to convince the world that they are the emerging superpower of the 21st century, well, you're missing the forest for the trees. China's consolidated power structure under a single leader who's changed the nation's very constitution to remain in power for life allows the nation to employ long-term strategies to shape perceptions of their policies, their objectives, and their military capabilities. And make no mistake, they aren't always successful. In fact, I think people are seeing through Chinese influence efforts more and more frequently in recent years. But China doesn't need to worry about temporary setbacks when their focus is set squarely on the long game. So as you read or watch coverage of China's recent military parade, or when you see headlines about a new academic paper out of China claiming that they can target stealth aircraft using satellites and fart machines, remember the discourse you're observing with your own two eyes is more than just information. A lot of times, it's information warfare. And with that, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandbox News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com